I want to now pivot over to our next speaker, Dr. Navarro, Dr. Alex Navarro, who's the Assistant Director at the Center for History of Medicine. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History with honors from Rutgers University and his Doctor of Philosophy and History from the University of Michigan. Dr. Navarro is a diplomatic, political, and intellectual historian, and has taught and conducted research on a wide range of topics, including U.S. Latin American history, U.S. Southeast Asian relations, Western labor relations, 20th century urban history, race, racism, and issues of national identity. Since joining the center in 2005, Dr. Navarro has focused much of his research on the historical, social, and economic and political ramifications of the 1918 and 2009 influenza pandemic. He was co-principal investigator and the lead researcher on the center's landmark study of the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions in the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic, and the center's qualitative examination of school health closures implemented during the 2009 influenza pandemic. Dr. Navarro is currently researching the interplay between territorial aggrandizement and disease during the Mexican-American War, particularly among American troops, for a forthcoming project. And he insists in developing programming at the center and in managing the center's daily operations. So Dr. Navarro is going to speak to us a little bit more about making the connection between institutionalized racism, housing, and how that has impacted segregation in the education system. Dr. Navarro?
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to everyone for having a lowly historian here join you today. Let me share my screen. So, as Dr. Navarro said, today I want to talk about education segregation and structural inequality. And I think that we can't really understand inequality in education without really understanding the role of the courts and the role the courts have played in the last 7 decades. And I think we also have to understand the role that these court decisions have in the context of spatial geography in America, residential patterns, housing discrimination, et cetera. And that this American spatial geography is really the results of decades of legal segregation in housing patterns. And so one of the things that bothers me is that when people use the term de facto school segregation, as it just happens to be happening. And that's not really true. It's really a result of de jure legal segregation in housing. Policies that date back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries, even when some of those policies, racially restrictive covenants, et cetera, were outlawed in 1968, they still continue in other ways, zoning ordinances and that sort of thing. And so my argument is that we have to understand these court decisions and the pattern that the courts have played, the role the courts have played in resegregation of American schools. And so I want to go through a couple of court cases. Most Americans don't think of these court cases, but I really do think they have an important impact on education in the United States. So, of course, most people are familiar with the Brown decision. In 1954, the Supreme Court overturned 6 decades of very entrenched Jim Crow segregation in education by declaring that separate facilities were inherently unequal and that this was a violation of a very important clause, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Okay, and it overturns the Plessy decision, but it said that separate was equal. People aren't necessarily aware that there was another Brown decision the following year. And that's in some ways a little bit more important because the court issued a second decision that rules that schools have to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And that's problematic for several reasons, because as important as the Brown 1 and 2 decisions are, that all deliberate speed clause leaves room for districts to resist desegregation, because typically what happens in civil rights cases is that when somebody's civil rights or a group's civil rights have been found to have been violated, there's an immediate redress of grievances. And that's not the case in Brown. This all deliberate speed statement comes in. And so by placing responsibility, the court places responsibility on desegregating on local school boards and on states. That combined with this all deliberate speed means that many places simply refuse to desegregate. Or they do the absolute bare minimum they can in an attempt to sort of pull an end run around this ruling. And so this foot dragging is evident by the very poor state of desegregation throughout the 1950s and actually well into the 1960s. The first and perhaps earliest case, or the best case, most important case that comes out of these early decisions is Green versus New Kent County in Virginia. Virginia had strongly resisted integration efforts even after the Brown decision. And it really wasn't until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 when the federal funding that states receive is going to be impacted if some of these southern states in particular don't start to desegregate. That's when they finally start to desegregate in Virginia. And what New Kent County does is there were two schools. There was a white school and a black school. And they adopted this freedom of choice plan. So students could choose which of the two schools they wanted to attend, but they had to apply or send this paperwork into a state-run board. And if they didn't actively choose to transfer, they were automatically assigned to the school they went the previous year. As a result of this, it was fairly difficult. It was a little bit burdensome for people to change schools. You can see here, it's not that clear, but this is a map for the Watkins school bus school system, or school rather, and that was the predominantly black school, the all black school before this case. And you can see that the students are being bused all across the county, well past the New Kent County school, which was the white school, to go send them to this Watkins black school. Once they came out with this freedom of choice plan, no white students chose to go to the all black school. Several hundred black students eventually chose to go to the all white school. And of course, they were harassed. They faced lots of opposition at this all-white school. The court also found that the facilities were not equal as well. And so the case makes it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that this freedom of choice plan is ineffective, that the school board was too slow to desegregate, and that, quote, the time for mere deliberate speed has run out. So 14 years after Brown, finally the court steps in and says that this deliberate speed clause has run out. And the Supreme Court further states that Brown, too, had charged schools with an affirmative duty to take whatever steps were necessary to dismantle racially unitary school systems. So it wasn't enough for schools to sort of sit back and put the burden on parents. School districts had to take an affirmative duty to eliminate racially unitary schools. And so New Kent County does comply, and they simply integrate the two schools by separating by grade level instead of race. So they make one school the high school and the other school the elementary and middle school. The next important case, and this is a very critical case, is because it's a turning point, is Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg. So there wasn't that much, North Carolina did not have as much opposition to desegregation plans as some other areas in the South. But what had happened is Charlotte City schools and Mecklenburg County schools had been separate. Then they were consolidated. And so that resulted in these majority black city schools and then majority white suburban schools. And less than 5% of black children in this school district attended integrated schools in the 60s when they finally joined these two school districts were consolidated. The case makes it to the courts, and the court rules that district courts, this is the Supreme Court, rules that district courts have three very powerful tools that they can enforce and impose on school districts. One is that racial quotas can be used as a starting point. They can't be used as an end point, but they can be used as a starting point, at least, to develop integration plans. Courts can also redraw school district lines if they have to as an interim corrective measure. They realize it's not going to help in the long term because of housing patterns, but at least in the interim, they can redraw school district lines. And this is really the critical part, is that district courts, the Supreme Court says that district courts can actually mandate and enforce busing plans for school districts. And they can transport both black students and white students to opposite race schools for the purpose of integration. Now, as you might imagine, this was extremely unpopular. It was seen as an imposition placed upon students, many of whom had to be bused long distances. And eventually, it is seen as an imposition on black students who are, in particular, bused very long distances in many communities. What makes the Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg case so important is not only does it give these powerful tools to district courts, but it's the last time the court is unanimous on a school segregation case. Because from this point onward, the court becomes split on this issue, and it moves ever more conservatively as we have some of the Nixon appointees sitting on the bench. The next important case, I would argue, is San Antonio versus Rodriguez in 1973. So Texas used a school financing system that guaranteed a certain low level of funding for all schools from the state, and then the rest of that money would come out of local property taxes. So this made for highly unequal school districts in terms of their funding. San Antonio Independent School District sued, and they argue that children have a constitutional right to education, and that this Texas funding plan discriminated against children living in poverty. So it's not necessarily about race, although it has highly charged racial implications, but it's mostly about poverty. The district court sides with San Antonio schools. It goes through the appeals court, and then it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court strikes down the lower court's decision. And it states that, in fact, there is no federal constitutional right to education. Now we have a bunch of textualists, originalists sitting on the bench. They read the Constitution. They say, nowhere does it mention education. Education is not a federal constitutional right. They also say, therefore, that unequal school funding is not illegal. And so school districts in the state can institute these unfair and unequal school funding programs. It's not illegal. And lastly, they rule that poverty is not a suspect class. That means that courts cannot view people who are poor as subjects of discrimination in and of that poverty itself. And so this case really sets the tone for the developing split in considering school segregation in light of residential housing and therefore funding patterns. And we see from this point on a rapid shift in segregation in education. The following year, the court hears a case out of Detroit, Milliken v. Bradley. It started in 1970 when plaintiffs filed the class action suit. And here they claimed that the Detroit school system was unlawfully segregated, and they asked the court to impose a plan that created a single non-racial school system. The really critical point about this argument, and a novel argument, was that they argued that the Detroit school system was not simply segregated because of de facto school conditions, but was in fact legally segregated, de jure segregated, because of governmental housing policies stretching back decades. And this is the first time that plaintiffs are trying to link the two in the courts. The district court does find that there was a combination of federal, state, and local policies and laws that had created a pattern of residential segregation in the Detroit metro area. And so the courts are recognizing now that it's not just about schools, at least the lower court recognizes it's not just about schools, but it's about spatial geography and residential housing patterns. And it finds that de facto school segregation can result from de jure housing segregation. And so the court orders the Detroit Board of Education, as well as 53, a large number of adjacent school districts in suburban areas across 3 counties that adjoin Detroit, to submit desegregation plans, because they realized that realistically the only way to integrate Detroit schools was to bus suburban children in and Detroit children to the suburbs, because of the way the housing patterns that had developed between the city of Detroit and in the outlying suburbs, many of which were in separate counties. It goes to the Circuit Court of Appeals. The Circuit Court of Appeals agrees with that decision. It makes it to the Supreme Court. And in a split decision, the Supreme Court disagrees. And they find that the district court went too far in this remedy. So this is just 3 years after this important Swan case, where the Supreme Court says that busing can be imposed. Now the Supreme Court shoots down that previous decision. And it finds that because these suburban districts had never labored under desegregation orders, they did not violate any desegregation orders. And that the racial makeup of their school districts was just the result of housing patterns and not policies. And in fact, I think they used the quote unknowable patterns, which, it's patently ridiculous. The court essentially argues that, well, white people choose to live in suburban areas across county lines. And so you can't force white children to be bused across those lines in order to desegregate an entirely different, in this case, Detroit school system. So in other words, any plan to desegregate Detroit has to rely only on a Detroit desegregation plan. But how is that going to be possible in a city that by the early to mid 70s is rapidly becoming a majority Black city with a majority Black school district? And so it's really impossible to do so, but the court never addresses that issue. We'll jump ahead to 1991. The Oklahoma City Schools versus Dowell. This is a very long case. It stretched over several decades. Oklahoma City had a very long-standing policy going back to the early 20th century segregated rather its schools. They maintained that policy despite the Brown decision. They really dragged their heels. It was supported by state and local laws that maintained housing segregation as well. In 1961, Dowell and others sued the district to end desegregation in schools. Dowell wins. The schools are finally ordered to desegregate, and the city creates a desegregation plan that uses neighborhood zoning. Several years later, in 1965, the court finds that this neighborhood zoning plan really wasn't working. It was failing to desegregate. And so they order eventually, in the coming years, as it makes its way through various courts, they order the school board in 1972 to implement a busing plan. And that busing plan lasts 5 years until 1977, when the school district says, we've achieved integration. Can we please remove this order? The court says yes. Of course, the school system becomes resegregated. And so in 1985, a group of parents sue, arguing that resegregation was occurring as a result of ending this busing decree. And the district court finds that whatever remaining segregation there was in the city school system was just a result of neighborhood housing patterns, and that the school district itself had not behaved in any discriminatory fashion, and therefore it wasn't on the hook to continue this busing plan. Court of Appeals reverses this decision. It goes to the Supreme Court. And finally, in 1991, the Supreme Court decides that the school district had complied with this original desegregation plan. The vestiges of de jure school segregation had been removed. And so it is what it is at this point. It's the result of housing patterns, not anything that the school district had done. And in the decades since 1991, school segregation, resegregation, I would argue, has increased dramatically across the United States in light of this really, I think, terrible Supreme Court decision. You know, the problem with busing plans is that they were originally conceived as temporary ways of desegregating schools, with the lofty hope that, you know, one day full integration would sort of carry on naturally. And the problem was that, you know, white families simply continued to move to neighborhoods or towns that allowed them to send their children to all or mostly white schools. And the courts really never addressed that connection between school segregation and de jure, really, housing segregation. And so the courts begin to step in at the behest now of white school districts and striking down busing programs. The last case I want to talk about is Seattle, parents involved, PICS, parents involved in community schools versus Seattle. Seattle and later Jefferson County, Kentucky, was added to the case, had a system that categorized children as either white or non-white. And they use this as a tiebreaker when assigning applicants from the middle school who are applying to the city's competitive high schools. And the city did this because they realized that there was this segregated housing pattern that had developed over the decades in Seattle that was hard to tackle, and that this was resulting in a lack of diversity in its schools. And so in order to attack that problem, just as a tiebreaker, they used this racial category in order to assign kids to try and ensure some level of diversity in the high school, in the city's competitive high schools. Well, parents involved is a mostly white community organization that springs up to fight this, and it makes its way to the courts, to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court finds that this plan violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And they said that students can't be classified on the basis of race, despite whatever lofty goals there may be of diversity and desegregation. They argue, the court states that Seattle was never subject to a mandated desegregation plan. So because of that, there was no compelling state interest in using race as a classification. Using race as a classification for school admissions, the court had previously decided, particularly in some higher education cases, could be used as a compelling state interest, but it had to be very narrowly tailored. And because Seattle was never mandated to desegregate, that didn't apply. And so once again, we see the court saying that school segregation is based on housing patterns, and therefore it's not illegal. And measures to limit the effect of that segregation cannot take into account race. How do you address the issue of racial segregation without taking into account the issue of race? I have no idea. This is what the court has ruled. And so where are we today? Well, over half of U.S. students across the country attend a racially concentrated school. We also know that racialized poverty is sort of a double whammy for students of color because being a poor student of color is far worse than being a poor white student. Students of color are not only twice as likely to live in poverty as their white counterparts, but they're at least 5 times as likely to live in an area of concentrated poverty with all of the deleterious social impacts that has and health impacts. We also know that school integration is one of the best means of achieving racial equity, but resegregation has accelerated in recent decades. And we know now that school segregation is directly tied to residential segregation. Where do we go from here? So I think first we need to keep some key issues in mind. One is that as powerful as a tool as it can be and was in the past, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment really provides little protection these days. It has become, unfortunately, weaponized, and it really now ensures that institutions must make race-blind decisions, even when attempting to address racially mediated systemic problems. And so I think we can't look to the courts any longer for remedies in the way that plaintiffs did in, say, the late 50s into the 60s and early 70s. The connections between housing patterns and school segregation are very well known, they're very well understood, but the courts have routinely refused to address these connections in meaningful ways, at least over the past several decades. I think we also need to be aware that de facto school segregation, as I mentioned when I started the talk, doesn't really exist. It's really legal segregation in residential patterns that was initially bolstered by Jim Crow era laws and policies, and in more recent decades by policies that privilege private capital, private development, urban renewal programs that are really aimed at the affluent, and programs that generally seek to protect white sensibilities about who gets to live where. And lastly, I think any talk we have about school reform in and of itself, that's really a dead end. So programs like we have here in Michigan, School of Choice, voucher programs that are being pushed pretty hard, increasing the number of charter schools, et cetera. None of these things address the root problem. And I would argue that these are all conservative, sort of what I call pseudo free market approaches to public education, right? The idea that if we somehow just introduce competition amongst schools, that would lift everyone up. And in fact, that's not the case. Not only is that ridiculous on the face of it, but we actually have plenty of data that shows that does not work, because public education isn't a commodity. It's infrastructure. I think we should consider it as infrastructure. And so if we allow public education to be treated as a commodity, we're really only further buying into this notion that de facto, quote unquote, school segregation is simply a result of market forces and who gets to buy homes in which neighborhoods and communities. And so we're really feeding into that by using the term de facto segregation and treating school segregation as somehow separate from housing. To the extent that people do that, I think we're just feeding into the whole idea that, well, if we just introduce some conservative competition between, conservative-minded competition between schools with voucher programs, et cetera, that we can get ourselves out of this predicament. I have some ideas about where we can go to make progress, but maybe I'll end here and then we can discuss those.